Hello out there, wherever you might be watching. We are broadcasting on the Facebook pages of KBOO Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon, as well as on the Facebook page of Popular Resistance and my own Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and LinkedIn accounts. And if I haven't missed anything, and this will be going up as a podcast afterwards if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever podcasts are found. And I've been doing this winter broadcast thing on Wednesdays at noon Pacific time, which is now. And a lot of the times lately it's been musical events, but today is going to be a conversation with none other than Scott Harris, who is a fantastic radio journalist, longtime broadcaster, and more or less neighbor, although we didn't know it, from Connecticut. And I'm just going to bring Scott on to the screen here with my fabulous technical abilities. Scott, great to have you here on the internet.
And, great to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me, David. Thanks.
Oh, great pleasure. And Scott, I when I lived in Connecticut, which is for a significant portion of my life, PKN was just outside of the listening area where I grew up, but in Wilton, just north of where you grew up in Norwalk. But I heard it a lot when I would, go more in the direction of Bridgeport, and ran across your show frequently as well as in podcast form. And I just want to, I was the way that the media landscape, both in independent and corporate and public and everything else, has evolved so dramatically over the past, over the course of your career. I mean, to me, that's a fascinating place to start, and we could just keep on going on that subject for hours, but we'll probably move on to other ones. But I wonder, I just want to start out getting some kind of an impression of what was it like doing independent media when you got into it, which I believe was in the 70s. Was it the mid 70s, late 70s, 77 or something around there when you first started being involved with what I guess they would have been calling the underground press at the time, or I don't know, what was underground still a common term for the alternative media at the time?
Well, when I went to college, I got involved with a local radio station that was in Western Massachusetts. And I grew up listening to alternative media, PKN, WBAI in New York, a whole range of other kind of mainstream talk shows. So I was really, very kind of passionate about radio and talk radio in particular, people talking about ideas. And I listened to right-wingers. I listened to some left-wingers who were on at the time in the late 60s, early 70s. And when I got into radio, I tried to, kind of follow in the footsteps of people I admired.
Were the right-wingers broadcasting on AM, or did they have shows on WBAI as well? Or BAI would have been mostly either music or left-wingers, or what was it like with the politics back then?
BAI has always been a lefty station, since I became a listener. But I would listen to AM radio. I'd listen to, there was this notorious right-winger named Brad Crandall, who was, would shout at people, hang up on them, all the kind of nonsense that still goes on right-wing radio. And there were some, nutty shows like Long John Nebel. People who are old as I am might remember him. More or less an entertainment show with kind of a conservative twist, and a whole range of others. There was another. There was an AM radio show, one of the only ones I remember growing up, with kind of a lefty liberal type. A guy named Alex Bennett, who people might remember, again, if they're as old as I am. But he was kind of like the token countercultural DJ and talk show host on some of the New York AM stations. I guess he had shows other places. But I also loved Gene Shepard, which I think even younger folks will know about from. What is
And
it?
Gene Shepard was broadcasting on what on AM or on BAI or
Yeah, he was a regular on, I think it was WOR, one of the AM station, one of the big AM stations in New York. And he was a great storyteller. I don't know if you've heard tapes of his radio show. There, you can find them on the internet now. Um, Wonderful storyteller. He wrote that movie, Christmas Story, right? You remember that, or maybe not.
a a Christmas Story or that one or what was what's this which Christmas Story?
I think it's just called the A Christmas Story, and it was about
Mm-hmm.
this kid growing up in Indiana, and all about his trials and travails with his parents growing up in Indiana. And Gene Shepard had this whole mythology about his childhood when he grew up in Indiana. So this movie was just kind of a glimpse at things he talked about on the radio when he was a young kid. But anyway, that's kind of like all part of what inspired me to do something on radio myself.
Was and the particular medium of radio was it the way that you can engage people and take them away and tell a story? I mean that particular sort of way that the oral tradition works on radio. What was what attracted you to the medium rather than I mean at the time that you were getting started with radio, I believe it is correct to say that there was a lot more of an underground press scene. I mean, a lot of the papers that we associate with the '60s were still publishing in the '70s, as I recall vaguely. And I mean, so there would have been like a lot more kind of avenues maybe for you to get involved with written form of alternative media, but radio was it right for you from the beginning. That was the attraction.
Yeah, I've done a little writing, but yeah, I was always just enamored with radio and the storytelling angle, and just hearing getting instant access to new ideas that you may not have come across before. When I was listening to the station I'm still at, WPKN, it kind of opened up a whole new universe of music. I mean, we all grew up listening to top 40 radio and the commercial stations that pumped out the same standard songs, the same hit list. But PKM was, kind of an avant-garde and very unique station in terms of they did a lot of politics, but they also did a lot, probably a greater share of the programming was dedicated to all manner of avant-garde jazz and things you'd not come across ordinarily on most stations. So it was kind of an education, both in culture and music and politics, listening to that station, along with WBAI as well.
And I mean, both PKN and BAI were and are part of a network of community radio stations that have kind of like, very often very different programming, but and sometimes really well organized and sometimes really messy, but they're the similar sort of connection with all these community stations is they program all kinds of stuff that wouldn't be found on the corporate stations, including all kinds of different music and all kinds of different politics that you wouldn't hear on the corporate stations. Yeah, but what did you get into? We started doing a show at PKN largely because geography. I mean, it was what you heard. It was what was on the dial in Norwalk between the PKN to the east and BAI to the west of you there, I guess.
Right.
And but was that basically it? That it was just that was what was around. And did you ever program at BAI, or you've always had your show at PKN?
No, I've had I had a show on Connecticut politics on BAI with another a writer friend of mine, Jim Motivali, who was also an early contributor to our Between the Lines syndicated show that we did later. But yeah, we did a lot of projects together. I was BAI and PKN very close to my heart, both of those stations. Um, but yeah, I was inspired by what I heard on those two stations, so that's kind of why I was really happy when I went to the program director, proposed a program. They said, "Yeah, we'll put you on." I think the first show I had was like 6 in the morning on a Wednesday or something. And
Hmm.
I remember the first show I did, which was a traumatic experience. I was very nervous, and the two programmers that were supposed to relieve me both didn't show up.
Oh,
So I
great.
ended up being on for like 8 or 10 hours. I forget what, but it was like
Oh
trial,
my goodness.
you know.
It's a very long time, especially when you're not like you're not doing music and just programming. You can't just put on the next record. But at the time where I imagine you must have resorted to that after an 8 hour program. You couldn't have been just talking the whole time or interviewing people the whole time.
Well, in those early days, I was doing a music show. I actually started off on PKN doing a blues music show,
Uh-huh.
which was another kind of favorite music genre that I loved. And yeah, so
How did you
yeah,
get
I
into?
got to put a lot of music on. I discovered a lot of new music that day. So,
Oh yeah, right in the library, right
oh yeah,
at the station.
we
And how
have a
did you get
very
into doing political stuff and interviewing people and that sort of thing? What was the motivating factor there? Was it you were doing a music show and then somebody said, "Well, there's this activist in town and you need some publicity. Can he be on your show?" I mean, I know that's happened to me a lot of the time where I've been passing through some town and then they put me on with somebody who just has no idea who I am or what I'm doing there, but somebody said, somebody should interview this guy, and I mean, not that that's a bad thing, but these things can happen in all sorts of different ways.
yeah. No, I was always kind of very passionate about politics, and when I was in high school, we would be protesting the Vietnam War and a whole range of other issues locally in town. There was a small group of us in our high school that were active, so it kind of came naturally that I would kind of extend what I was doing on the air in those early days to you know try out some interviews on the air with our really clunky phone system that didn't work half the time. It was like,
Yeah.
hello, hello. It was like tin cans with strings back in those days, but we made it work somehow. But yeah, I was gradually getting into more and more politics on the air versus the music, and eventually shifted over to just doing an exclusively political talk show.
And I wonder what was the what I wonder what kind of backlash you faced for doing a political talk show at the time. I mean, it wasn't. I was only let's see, 9 years old in 1976, but I remember 1976 particularly well because there was just such a year long display of over the top patriotic nuttiness coming out of at least the television set. I mean, I don't know, it was the backlash against the 60s, and there was so much attitude in the mainstream society about those hippies should just grow up and get with the program and live with reality as it is. And I mean, I just wonder what the atmosphere of doing political programming or political activism in the 70s strikes me as a very different time from doing that work in the 60s. Not that there wasn't opposition, but there was a groundswell of a movement. And when you were doing this work in the 70s, as you describe, it was your small group of anti-war friends in Norwalk, right? And that kind of seems to me to sum up the atmosphere at the time. It wasn't like you were having big school walkouts. It was a small group of anti-war folks at the high school.
Yeah, well, when I was in high school earlier, we did have big walkouts, but later on, you're right. The climate changed. The political environment went more conservative. And, especially in the waning days of the Carter administration, when we got Reagan, it was
Hmm.
full blown friendly fascism from Ronald Reagan and his team of corrupt idiots. So, yeah, we always had kind of a very hardcore base of listeners at WPKN where I began, and they were always very embracing of what we did and supportive. But there were people who called up and tried to their best to insult me or go on the air and start ranting. But for the most part, I have to tell you, the worst of it happened during the Trump years. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, when I compare backlash, as you talked about, with Reagan and what happened in the decade there that he was in the White House versus what happened in the 4 years Trump was in the White House, it's 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 incomparable. I mean, death threats and just the all range of insane people would be calling this station and on our social media networks. Just it's hard to describe the kind of venom and just over the top insanity. The kind of climate denial rolled in with I still get this vaccine and COVID denial nonsense. It's really, as many people describe it, it's like we've got millions of people in this country living in an alternative universe, a very evil, insane, hard to comprehend universe. So I would
How
compare
do
him
you?
with
I mean,
that.
that it is so interesting that it is like as you described such a wildly polarized situation now, because it's not like, I mean, if you think back to the Vietnam War, for example, it's not like there wasn't a hell of a lot of polarization in society then too. I mean, right, you had some people thinking that it was a good thing to kill millions of people if it meant liberating Vietnam from the evil grip of communism, and then you had other people, a whole lot of other people, saying that we were committing some of the worst war crimes in the history of humanity and against the civilian population of Vietnam. Very different takes on the same phenomenon that was going on, during which time tens of thousands of American soldiers were also dying. I mean, it's a pretty polarized situation, but it is, as you described, so much more polarized under Trump. And I wonder what is that all about? I mean, how much do you? I mean, this was happening to you on a radio station, but how much do you attribute this alternative reality situation to social media? Or I want your analysis, because I mean, when you were young and when I was young, I mean, there was still right wingers, rabid right wingers, raging on AM radio. It wasn't like these views were hard to find. I mean, they were out there, easy enough to find. But things are different now.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in part it's social media gives a lot of people on all sides of any question more access, right? And they certainly have an avenue, the tools to use to talk back and say their piece. Whether it's coherent or not, it's another story. But I think there's something else at work now. And I think Trump and the people surrounding Trump have given license to the racists, the extremely hateful and violent people to come out from under their rocks. And maybe that wasn't quite so true in the Nixon and Reagan years. I think there was still some societal kind of breaks on the kind of hate speech and blatant racism that we get now with these folks. They feel it's just fine. It's been normalized, and you can see it on TV every goddamn day. It's carried as if it's just normal part of the societal dialogue at this point. So I think that's contributed to at least the kind of um, the conversations that are going on, or the screaming matches that are going on now.
And then what about the? I mean, so there's the algorithms and there's social media. So many more people being able to produce content and of course consume it, and of course this also has had an impact on other ways that people get information. And I mean, for a lot of people, whether they're musicians or broadcasters, people have been able to make the transition, at least in many cases, from radio to podcasts. And but what has I mean, I get the impression generally that there's a lot fewer people listening to radio today than there were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Is that your impression, or not so much?
I don't know. One of the problems we face as a community radio station, speaking just from the perspective of what I know at PKN, uh, the supporters, people who are involved as volunteers at the station, people who contribute most of the money, are folks from an older generation. And one of the things that's kind of concerning me and many others is that stations like ours, and I think we're not the only case here, we have to do a better job of reaching out to younger folks because I think with social media and podcasts, people are they're kind of programming their own material. They and I knew this is true with music as well, right? Um, it used to be you kind of went down the radio dial and see what you liked or discover something new possibly by accident. It's kind of like looking through a newspaper, right? You come across an article you might not otherwise read. But now you're kind of selecting in advance what you're going to surround yourself with, whether it's politics or culture or music or anything else. And unless you're kind of reaching out beyond your algorithm bubble on purpose to be exposed to new things, you may very well be a prisoner of that bubble and not discover new stuff. So a lot of younger people don't listen to the radio. They're not listening to the radio stations in their car like I used to, and you probably did too.
Yeah.
They have things in their iPod or however however these younger folks do it these days. It's something we've talked about at our station. We're doing podcasts now, of course, and hopefully that reaches new folks that don't they're not acclimated to be thumbing through the radio dial every day. So we have our work cut out for us. I think it's not as easy to attract new listeners as it used to be using the old tools.
What about the impact of on the culture generally, or on your life, or just any reflection at all of the in 1981, I believe it was when the fairness, what was it, the fairness in media or something, the Reagan
The fairness
really
doctrine, yeah.
yeah. When Reagan deregulated the media, basically at that point, and then later, I mean, there were various other waves of deregulation and allowing fewer corporations to own more stations and all that. But and then also with the fairness doctrine, I believe it was. Now I'm fuzzy on the details, but I believe it was that also resulted in local commercial radio stations no longer needing to maintain news departments. And then there were, I think, 5,000 local radio journalists who lost their jobs all at the same time around that time. This is information coming from somebody else, and I don't know where her information comes from, but I'm pretty sure that this is accurate or more or less accurate. But what changed with 1981 and that how did the media change at that point? Was it really obvious in any immediate way, or slowly became obvious, or?
Well, I think that the fairness doctrine, as I recall, dealt mostly with FCC regulations where licensed stations were obligated to provide equal time on any given issue. So when that was erased, when that was done away with, that's when the Rush Limbaughs and people came out of the woodwork, because you could have this, you know, screaming idiot on the air, riling people up for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time, and that station had no obligation to put on any other points of view. So that's how you got the kind of crop of right wing radio talk show hosts that today has developed into the kind of most bizarre guy in media these days, Alex Jones. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that's his antecedents, is that these folks laid the groundwork for conspiracy theory and hate monger radio. But yeah, that's where it came from, as the stations were allowed, with their major corporate sponsors, to put these extreme right wingers on the air, and had no obligation to provide any other points of view on their airwaves. That had been the case earlier, and stations wouldn't have done it, because they they wanted to program stuff that was probably broadcast, in attracting as many formula after the fairness doctrine was gotten rid of, and realizing that if you push people's emotional buttons and make them froth at the mouth, that you might have some more loyal listeners than you otherwise would have. I don't know exactly what the the marketing and profit end of it was. But obviously, it was profitable, and it was
Yeah.
backed by some of the biggest corporations in America who love people like Rush Limbaugh on the air, preaching against taxes and affirmative action and any kind of environmental regulation. That was kind of like the main staple of these right wingers in the early days. And they would, of course, uh, they would also, of course, support U.S. wars abroad. That was another huge component of this kind of militaristic, jingoistic style that these right wing talk show hosts were famous for.
And speaking of wars abroad, one of the main sort of, I guess, in terms of what we would characterize as left wing political movements that were going on in the United States in the 70s and 80s, was around solidarity with the people of Central America and opposition to U.S. Imperial actions and supporting proxy armies and massive military funding and everything else, and the dictatorships in Central America, or fighting against the guerrilla movements and all sorts of different things going on. But I wonder, the the atmosphere of the anti-intervention movement at that time, and what kind of, like, I guess, what was the, it's a very vague, broad question, but I'm just wondering, what was the scene like in terms of that movement, and what did it feel like? How did the movement perceive itself? Did you feel like you were making any headway? Did you feel like you were always losing, or was there a sense that there was sometimes you fight and you win?
Well, I certainly was very much involved in the Central America solidarity movements in the early days after Reagan got in office. Of course, he launched the Contra War in Nicaragua, was supporting the military death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, and it was a bloodbath down there. And after the Sandinista revolution was victorious in 1979, a couple of years later, in 1981, I went down to Nicaragua and did some reporting from there. And this was just before the Contra War had started. So I got to know a lot of people down there, got a sense of what the country was doing and how it was changing in terms of literacy campaigns and, the health clinics that were opening up, and a lot of, you know, very positive developments in that country after 40 years of US supported dictatorship by Anastasio Somoza and that whole family. And when I came back to the States, I continued to cover the things going on in Central America. But of course, when the Contra War began, I sort of dedicated a lot of my broadcast time to opponents of the war and the various grassroots movements here in the US that were organizing to oppose the horrible just murder that was going on there. These fascist folks that the U.S. had been supporting, and of course, this was a great way to educate folks who are listeners, not just about that war, but about all the imperialist history of the United States and the dozens of wars and coups and overthrows of governments that the United States was doing in Latin America, in Iran, and the whole Vietnam War era. It was a way really to delve into U.S. foreign policy and its history, and to talk more broadly about what people should be aware of about their own country's history. So, I also was involved in the early days of opposition to the Contra War with a group called Pledge of Resistance,
Mm-hmm.
where people would engage in nonviolent civil disobedience to, get some focus on the issue in front of congressional offices, at the post office. Would be street demonstrations, the things that people are familiar with in terms of being active. But later, I found an outlet apart from the radio end of it and the Pledge of Resistance. I was inspired by a group in New Haven, Connecticut, that had formed a sister city partnership with the city of Leon in Nicaragua. And we eventually formed one in the Norwalk area with Nagarote, which is a small town right between Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, and Leon. Nagarote was an interesting little town that we got our mayor of Norwalk at that time, Bill Collins, to visit. We formed the
Mm,
committee first. He went down there with a group of other legislators and kind of made the sister city relationship official, which was extremely lucky. And
great.
Bill Collins is still around and still doing great stuff. And um, yeah, the Sister City project that we began back in 1986 is when we started it. Um, it's still going strong. And through all the turmoil in Nicaragua, the politics and the violence a few years ago in the streets, and we've survived and focused a lot on after school programs for children. We have a community center that's thriving over there, scholarships for colleges, and we got a great group of people here in our area and around New England who support this work. We have an organic farm down there. So some positive things have developed out of that horrible time, I can say, because otherwise we would have never known about the people in Nagarote, and they wouldn't have known about us. And I guess that's the beauty of a sister city relationship.
Do you have any particular reflections on what's been going on in Nicaragua for the past few years that keeps on continually making international headlines?
Um, you, I've been kind of depressed by what's going on in Nicaragua. I've always been supportive of the Sandinista party, but Daniel Ortega seems to have taken on a lot of traits that are not healthy for what's going on there. Um, so I'm critical of what's going on. And one of the latest incidents that happened, some of his former allies in the early Sandinista movement have been arrested, and it's it's disappointing to say the least. But I will also say that the United States and its threats, its economic embargo, the history of slaughter against the people of Nicaragua, it can make you do things as a leader of a country that's been the target of that kind of uh, violence and harassment. It can make you do things that might seem rational if I were in their shoes. I can't possibly know all that's going on in Nicaragua behind the scenes. So while I'm critical, I don't profess to have a black and white view of what's happening there. All I know is
Such
that,
a good point, isn't it? I mean, when the people who think the CIA is out to get them in so many cases, they are absolutely correct, and
yes,
it's really happening. And the CIA has incredible resources, and no level of paranoia is too paranoid. I mean, when Hugo Chavez for years was not flying right anywhere. I mean, he was constantly canceling plans to fly because he had information that the CIA was planning on shooting down his plane.
yeah,
And then, of course, people in places like, many normal people in the US might hear this kind of thing, if they hear it at all, and they think, oh, what a paranoid nutcase, not realizing that how many Latin American heads of state have actually been killed by their planes getting shot out of the sky. I mean, this is not even, there's been I think at least two or three of them. This is not a minor thing to be, not, yeah, nothing paranoid about it, but
no, you're right.
yeah.
And in fact, when I was in Nicaragua back in those early days, we met a few kids on the street who pointed at us and said, "CIA, CIA." We said, "No, no, we're not CIA." We actually got to be good friends with these young kids, and they showed us all around. And but like you said, that history it makes an indelible mark on people and can dictate your behavior. And
Yep.
it's almost by design, when the United States has all these plans afoot to overthrow you or undermine you or bankrupt the country or embargo you, uh, it has this self fulfilling prophecy of people are going to clamp down on what's going on in their country when there is an attack from outside, which the United States has a long history of doing in many, many countries.
And then they'll accuse you of human rights abuses, of course,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
I mean, and of course, there's in endless numbers of other examples like that. But I mean, of course, lately in the news, even more than Nicaragua is China, and of course, you know, all, all the horrors that have been meted out against any of the people in Western China over the past 600 years, we can be sure that the U.S. doesn't care about those people in Western China, and they just want to foment ethnic rebellion in order to foment crackdowns, in order to complain about human rights abuses, or in order to hopefully destabilize China with some kind of ethnic rebellion. And I mean, this is the U.S.'s MO all over the world for so long. It seems like, I mean, not it seems, it has been, certainly in Nicaragua as well. But um, yeah, so. Getting back to the question of sort of different kinds of media and podcasts and stuff like that, I think one of the things I was looking at your podcast, looking at my podcast. We both have like about 100 followers on podcast land, right? But I mean, or there's other ways to reach people, obviously, both on the internet as well as on radio. Obviously, you can't measure your listeners so easily, but there's a lot of people, independent journalists, independent musicians, people trying to work with the internet today, who are constantly figuring out ways to reach audiences. And one of the things I just learned recently is that although I have very few podcast followers, 23% of the people who listen to me on Spotify heard my music because of Spotify's algorithms recommending my music because they like some other music that Spotify thinks is related to me. So this is kind of one of the, I mean, algorithms can play in different ways, and sometimes they can potentially have a positive impact on some people. But that's one way that people try to do outreach, get into playlists and algorithms and figure out how to ride them or whatever. But in the terrestrial space of media, between the lines, has you guys formed a group that was quite a while ago, that was involved with basically marketing the show in order to, and it has become a very successfully syndicated show on, I believe, 60 different community radio stations around the country. And I wonder if you could talk about that process, because yeah, there's other content creators out there who I think are interested in this sort of process, and what made you think about doing it? And because popular education, as you do, can be just a thing that's local for the local listening area, and or it can be a syndicated show, or it can be in different kinds of mediums. And I just I guess in terms of both journalists or musicians or anybody else, I think a lot of people have a sort of cup half full, cup half empty kind of orientation, which can affect whether they think about even bothering to try to syndicate their show or not. So I'm just wondering about the thought process there, and then how you did it actually quite successfully.
Yeah. So we began in yeah, I'm forgetting what year, but we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. So I guess it was 1991.
And
So
there's a party next month online, right?
yeah, we have a celebration coming up, and I can tell you more about that later. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we began uh, back in 1991. We had a show dedicated to what was then the first Persian Gulf War that George H.W. Bush started. That's
Oh, and
before.
incidentally, today, January 26th, as is just nailed into my head. January 19th and January 26th, 1991, there were major anti-war protests in D.C. And that date is always in my head. And today's January 26th. So,
Okay, well, this is the right way time to reminisce about those days. But yeah, we started a program to address all the misinformation that was in the U.S. media at that point. It was just blatant propaganda, as there still is today, about foreign affairs. We can talk about Ukraine in a moment, but
yes.
yeah, there was the drumbeat for war, and of course, Saddam Hussein had attacked and invaded Kuwait. It was a real tense time, and it was actually a war eventually. H.W. Bush launched it, but we started our program to directly address all the crazy disinformation coming out of the major TV networks and newspapers. And after the war was over, we continued the program and began to syndicate it by, you know, speaking with folks at other community radio stations near us, and then eventually across the country. And in those days, we had two methods to distribute the program: cassette tapes, mailed. So
Yeah.
you remember cassette tapes. And then later on, we also used Pacifica, the Pacifica Radio Network got something called a KU satellite, which was an inexpensive satellite system that stations could afford the downlink. And we distributed that way too. And of course, once the internet arrived, we could get our show up anywhere in the world very quickly through uh, uploading the show to our website and to multiple other websites that are, I think, called aggregators, where they can put the show out to any number of folks. We have about 70 stations, but we probably have more than that because we're always finding new stations broadcasting our stuff because we give it away for free.
Yeah.
Um,
So they don't have to tell you; they can just take the MP3 and broadcast it, right?
yeah, and they can do that, and we'd like to know where they are so we can help publicize what they're doing and kind of have some mutual support, but we don't always know. Um, so it's a lot of fun knowing your show is on different cities around the country. I have people, who travel around, and folks call us from Portland, Oregon. We have so many stations in Washington State. I don't know why there, but we have a lots there and on the northwest coast of the country. So it's worked out well, and we have. I should tell folks that Between the Lines started in 1991 with an all volunteer staff. No one was paid to do this every week. It's a half hour news magazine format. So we have, probably 10, 12 people working on the show every week.
Wow.
And I can tell you, we're all still volunteer. Myself and everyone who works on the show doesn't get paid anything. We do it because we fancy ourselves citizen journalists. We're passionate about uh, politics and addressing the information gap that only independent media can fulfill. So that's why we still do it after 30 years. And time has gone by quickly. I could say that. Doesn't seem like 30 years.
No. And the crew has evolved over time. The 10
Yeah,
people involved.
we have some stalwarts that are still a core group that's still with us, but yeah, we have a whole range of new people every few years. People come in and leave, and um, met a lot of wonderful folks who volunteered with the show over these many years, and we stay in touch. And they move away, but they always let us know that we're doing the right thing when they listen to the show that they used to be part of. But
There was somebody recently talking about. I mean, I guess I think about this a lot, and I, especially because I travel a lot in different countries, and in different countries, conditions are so different in so many ways, and so it's an easy contrast to make between one place and another. But it seems like in some places there are institutions that just continue through the generations or through the decades at least, and that have some kind of self-perpetuating thing about them. Like in some cases, I'm thinking of the Socialist Youth Federation in Denmark, for example. There are sort of, I don't know exactly how it works, but I believe it's a left-wing political party that provides them with a budget, or somehow or other they have a budget. They have offices all over the country. So to maintain this group, and for there always to be new members of the group coming in, it's like this continually maintained phenomenon of which always has new teenagers entering into this Socialist Youth Federation, and then doing whatever they do, which always includes putting on shows for me. So I'm very aware of the group and what they're doing, because I'm kind of they're one of their musicians basically.
right.
But this kind of phenomenon in other, I hear people complain, and I'm probably one of them, about the phenomenon in other countries, including in the U.S., where this kind of this kind of like perpetuating institutions just doesn't necessarily happen. It doesn't get off the ground. I mean, I can think of so many peace and justice centers in the 80s that were in towns all over the country, and probably 98% of them don't exist anymore, which is, of course, this kind of thing happens for all sorts of different reasons. Obviously, gentrification and the property prices, all kinds of different reasons, not necessarily through any fault of movements and their, inability to organize or whatever. There's obviously a very complicated picture here, but I wonder if you have thoughts on that, being part of one of those very institutions yourself.
Well, I think you're right. It's rare that a grassroots, especially a progressive or lefty institution, can stand the test of time. I've seen a lot of wonderful groups and institutions and newspapers and magazines and all manner of groups disappear over the years. I've been very lucky, talking about our Sister City project. It still persists, and our radio show still persists. But that's probably has a lot more to do with the people who are involved and the dedication they have, rather than having some kind of supportive environment to help it keep it afloat. But I've talked with Nation Magazine national correspondent John Nichols, as well as Robert McChesney, a professor of media studies.
Yes.
And, they've written a book and have addressed this a lot in their writings about how other nations, as you just talked about, maybe in Denmark, where there is taxpayer funds that flow to a diversity of groups, not just left or right, but all manner of groups and publications and media to keep the kind of diverse voices in their society, which is a sign of health for a democracy, right? And I wish we would push harder for things like that, and maybe we will. but that would be nice to get some institutional support for unique and interesting groups like ours, and for musicians as well. Certainly, we had support for musicians back in the New Deal days, right? There were all sorts of cultural organizations during the FDR days that unfortunately ended with his presidency.
Yep. In Sweden, I discovered a few years ago that if a newspaper has 2,000 or more subscribers, then the government gives them a full-time staff of 6.
Wow.
Paid like Swedish salaries, to run the paper. So the proletarian newspaper in Sweden has a staff of 7. So I guess they have enough of a subscriber base to actually pay for 1 staff member, and then the government gives them 6 more. So and then I was telling this to some folks that have a newspaper in Denmark, and they weren't aware of this program in Sweden, and it suddenly made all kinds of sense to them why the Swedish paper does so much more background research on their stories and stuff like that. Yeah, interesting. So
I guess if there's no strings attached, that would be the only caveat, right?
Yeah, there are no strings attached. They can it can be any number of different political perspectives. They support right-wing papers in the same way in Sweden. Yeah.
And that's healthy. And I wish we would do that here. But, right now we have to struggle. We have to dumpster dive for meals and live in refrigerator boxes to make ends meet. But I guess we're passionate enough about it so that we do that.
That's right. They might call it scrappiness somewhere, but it's in one thing in Denmark is when you ask if somebody's a volunteer in some kind of situation, there's a thing in a number of different European countries. There's this real rejection of the whole concept of trying to maintain institutions through volunteerism, and of course we'd reject the concept if we had that chance, but to have government funding for people to to do community radio or to do any number of other things. But tell me about what's going on next month. The Between the Lines turns 30, and there's a series of activities.
Yeah, we, every 5 years or so, we do a little anniversary presentation. We've done a whole series of public forums going back to when Howard Zinn was still alive. We would invite a whole series of folks. We had Michio Kaku, and we had I'm trying to think of who else we had. Greg Palast, Jeremy Scahill, a whole number of folks talk about a range of topics during our sort of every 5 year anniversary thing. And those were live events. But of course, with COVID, this 30th anniversary year, we had so many fits and starts about when this pandemic was going to end. I think we made the right decision just to go with a virtual event this year.
Yeah.
So we're very excited. We've just recorded a panel discussion with some great folks, and they include former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner, who's certainly well known as Bernie Sanders' election or campaign surrogate, and unfortunately was beat in large part because of, I think, corporate media had it out for her when she ran for a congressional seat in Ohio recently. But she's part of a panel discussion along with Bill Fletcher Jr., who's a really well-respected labor and racial justice activist, Greg Palast, I should say, who's award-winning investigative journalist who really is single-handedly, I think, exposed the voter suppression going back to the 2000 election in Florida with the caging and all that. We also have Adrian Hawk, who's a wonderfully energetic youth climate activist and organizer, and Victor Picard, professor of media studies at the University of Pennsylvania, a great guy. He's our moderator. So the topic that we're going to have this panel talk about is the crisis in U.S. journalism and the future of independent media and democracy, given that we think media and independent media and democracy are all intertwined, especially these days. Yeah. So it's an exciting discussion. We'll be putting stuff out on our website and through social media, and all the panelists will as well. So we'll kind of make it known the exact date and time that it's going to go live. We're also going to have greetings from Norman Solomon, John Nichols, Kevin Gray, Medea Benjamin, and we're going to have a song from a guy you might have heard of named David Rovix. He's going to be entertaining us through a piece of this as well. Thank you, David.
Of course.
Well, we don't have the date yet because not all the pieces are put together, but we'll let that be known very soon. And we'll also have it around for a long time on all sorts of media venues so you can watch it anytime.
Scott, as somebody who's been sitting in a small dark room with headphones on for decades, how different was it to do that during the pandemic?
You mean to put together this
in terms of actually doing radio? I mean, I think for a whole lot of people during the pandemic, they're not. I mean, of course, a lot of people have been getting used to the internet and including streaming media and Zoom and whatever before the pandemic, but I think a lot of people were a lot less familiar or comfortable with the idea of sitting in a closet with headphones on and a microphone in front of their face. But it's something that you had been doing a long time. Although maybe in PKN you got something better than a closet. I don't know. But I mean, so many of the I can't remember what PKN looks like in the inside, but so many community radio stations around the country are in like small dark rooms in the basement with no windows. So I'm just imagining it's like that too.
Well, Two things. WPKN recently moved to wonderful new studios, and
Nice. With
there's a whole
Windows?
history of how we moved and why we moved. I won't get into, but our listeners really came through, and we got the funds to. We had to move from our previous location, and oh, it's a real, like you said, it was like a smelly locker room that we lived in for 30, 40 years there at that other
Yeah.
place. But now it's like sparkling brand new with new equipment that works. And
Oh,
so
nice.
that's a blessing. But when I go there, nobody's there because everybody's doing their shows remote. I'm the only one because I do it live on the phones. I come in to do it live. Um, we record our Between the Lines program here at my house in my home studio, and we used to have people come in and narrate the news and such before COVID, but we haven't done that in a while. And I'm very grateful to my wife Anna Manzo, who's a big part of the production of Between the Lines every week, and she's been drafted as our newsreader for these last 2 years. Sometimes tensions are high during the recording sessions, as a wife and husband can have go on sometimes, especially when we're talking about how to pronounce foreign leaders' names from Vladivostok and such. But we make
Great.
it work. We make it work.
Yeah, not all married couples should necessarily work together, but it can be a great relationship building exercise as well, perhaps, if it doesn't do the opposite. I
It's
listen to
worked out.
BBC World Service so much that I can pronounce any foreign leader's name, and I can do it better than most American news readers, I have to say, because they don't listen to BBC World Service, and I don't know where these other news readers get their pronunciation from, but BBC has a whole department that does that with like actual native speakers and stuff. So if you want to know how to say Morgan Changarai correctly, I don't know how correct that is, but it's not Sangarai, it's Changarai. But how often does anybody talk about Zimbabwe on the news? You wouldn't, a lot of
That's
people
true.
wouldn't know how to say that.
Hey, David,
Yeah.
before um, we conclude, I just want to thank you for all your music. And I should have said this earlier, but your music is a big part of my radio show all these years because whenever there's a topic that I'm talking about on the air and I need some segue music to go to the next interview, there you are. David Rovics, look him up. He's got a song about it from a progressive perspective. So it fits in like, nothing else would. So,
Thank you. It's kind.
and just not in terms of my show alone, but just the music that you produce and the messages in that music are just incredibly valuable. As we know, music has a way of communicating things that speech alone cannot. So I thank you for all these years of great music you produce for all of us.
Thank you. You're very kind. I think we need music between the news stories, especially good topical music. It really, I mean, just not just my own, but just from a basic communication perspective. If you're doing education, you're talking about a story. If you can then play a song that pulls on people's heartstrings that's related to the story you just did, which is what songs do. It's just because that's what music does. You don't need to beat them over the head with it. You just tell a story and you do it in song form. It's going to affect people emotionally, and it seems like I guess I would have to say a fairly obvious way to follow up a news story, but sadly it's not universal, I've noticed. And I'm not going to mention any particular shows out there that don't do it very well, but there's some that a lot of people listen to that I wish they would play more contemporary music rather than another Pete Seeger song, much as I love Pete Seeger.
What are the most memorable songs that you wrote that I play whenever the topic comes up or a related topic, and that is The Dying Firefighter about 9/11. That's just an incredibly powerful song, and it has such a nuanced message about that terrorist attack and how some of us rose above the kind of gut violent response that our nation ended up doing. But yeah, it remains a really important piece of music that I think if people haven't heard it, they should.
Wonderful review. Thank you. Great talking to you, Scott. It's been a great pleasure. And hope to see
Thanks,
you
David.
soon.
I'm
Thank
glad
you.
to do this. It's fun to be on the receiving end of an interview rather than being
Yeah, right,
the
isn't
interview.
it? I always like I never did interviews until the pandemic started, but I always wanted to do a little bit of journalism. So it's been a great little pandemic as far as that goes.
All right.
All right, take care. See you again
Thanks, David.
next month, in fact.
Okay.
And that was Scott Harris, host of Between the Lines Radio News Magazine. And tune in somewhere on the internet next month for the 30th anniversary celebration of the program. And I'll be back next week with another Wednesday programming event of some kind, probably involving an octave mandolin if I get it back from the shop in time. And otherwise, keep on keeping on. Don't pay the rent unless you really have to. And remember, mutual aid and solidarity can solve all of our problems. Bye for now.